Welcome. This is Calculating Capitalization Rate, Wealth Creation through Syndication. My name is Jeffrey Smith. Objectives. Review time value of money, TVM principles. Understand the debt constant. Calculate net operating income, NOI. Calculate the capitalization rate, CAP. Calculate the gross return on equity, ROE. ROE. Time value of money. There are 5 TVM variables. Term, the number of periodic payments. Rate, the periodic interest rate. PV, the present value. PMT, the periodic payment. FV, the future value. Any variable can be computed from the other 4 variables. Only the rate variable is computed iteratively. The other variables are each directly computed. Cash flowing out is negative. Cash flowing in is positive. Example 1. Time value of money. Periodic payments. The term, 300. 300 monthly payments is 25 years. Periodic interest rate, 0.5%. That's 6% per year. Periodic debt constant, 0.6443%. It's slightly higher than the periodic interest rate because it also includes principal repayment. Annual debt constant, 7.7316%. That's the periodic debt constant times 12, the number of payments per year. Debt present value, $120,000. Debt future value, 0, fully amortizing. The periodic payment, expressed as a negative number for cash flowing out, 773.16. That's simply the negative debt present value times the periodic debt constant. The annual debt service, negative 9,277.92. That's simply the negative debt present value times the annual debt constant. Example 2, time value of money. Periodic payments, 60. For 60 months, that's 5 years. Present value, the debt present value, negative 20,000. This is an equity investment in a cash flowing asset. Periodic payment is 400. It's the monthly net income from the positive cash flow asset. The annual cash flow is simply the number of periodic payments per year times the cash flow per payment, 4,800. Future value, debt future value, 10,000. This would be the salvage value that you redeem from selling the asset after the 5 years. The periodic yield constant is 2%. That's the periodic payment divided by the debt present value. The annual yield constant is 24%. The annual yield rate would be 17.7142%, or 1.4762% per month. That is, you put in $20,000 today, you collect $400 per month, and at the end of the 60 payments, you collect a final salvage value of $10,000. Combine that together, it's as if you loaned $20,000 at an annual rate of 17.7142%, receiving $400 per month and a $10,000 balloon. Annual debt constant. The annual debt constant, ADC, is also called the annual mortgage constant, AMC, or the annual yield constant, AYC, or the annual loan constant, ALC. The annual debt constant is the periodic debt constant, PDC, multiplied by the number of periods per year. The PDC is a blending of the periodic interest rate and the amortization term. The amortization term is the number of periodic payments to amortize the present value, PV, to the future value, FV. The PDC is the periodic payment, PMT, for a present value, PV, of -1, a future value of 0, a rate, and a term. If rolling in incentive points, then the PV is -1 divided by the quantity 1 minus points. 1 point is 1% as a margin rate of the total present value. Annual property operating data. For an income property, we start with the gross scheduled income, with all units fully occupied and fully paying income. We then subtract the vacancy factor, subtract the credit loss, actual rental income. We then add the other income, such as laundry services, satellite TV, cable TV, to arrive at the effective gross income. We then subtract the gross operating expenses. These are just the expenses related to operating the property, nothing to do with debt on the property, to arrive at the net operating income, NOI. If you paid all cash for the property, then the net operating income would be the net spendable cash coming to you. Since most real estate transactions do not involve all cash purchases, they involve debt, we must then subtract the annual debt service from the net operating income to calculate the net cash flow before tax. Calculating capitalization rate. Net operating income, NOI, equals EGI minus GOE. That's the net operating income equals the effective gross income minus the gross operating expense. Capitalization rate is the net operating income divided by the maximum allowable offer. This is also called the bid price. The maximum allowable offer is the net operating income divided by the cap rate. Just a simple algebraic substitution. The annual debt constant is equal to the annual debt service divided by the debt present value. The debt present value is equal to the annual debt service divided by the annual debt constant. Loan-to-value ratio is simply the debt present value divided by the maximum allowable offer, or the price of the property. Debt coverage ratio is the net operating income divided by the annual debt service. From these equations, we can then calculate the cap rate. It's equal to the net operating income divided by the maximum allowable offer. It's also equal to the debt coverage ratio times the annual debt constant times the loan-to-value ratio. You can see here through simple substitution, the debt coverage ratio is the net operating income over the annual debt service. The annual debt constant is the annual debt service divided by the debt present value. The loan-to-value ratio is the debt present value divided by the maximum allowable offer. We can see here that the annual debt service appears on both the top and bottom of the division. The debt present value appears on the top and bottom of the division. Therefore, those values cancel out, leaving just net operating income over maximum allowable offer. Thus, we have proven the mathematical equivalency of these two expressions. Return on equity. Gross return on equity, ROE, is also called the cash-on-cash return, CCR. Equity is the equity to value, ETV, times the maximum allowable offer, MAO. Net cash flow, NCF, is the cash flow margin, CFM, times the net operating income, NOI. The row is the NCF divided by the equity. That is, you take your net cash flow divided by how much cash you invested in the property, and that is your return on equity. The row is calculated from the debt coverage ratio, annual debt constant, and loan-to-value ratio, similar to the capitalization rate, CAP. Calculating return on equity. Debt coverage ratio, net operating income divided by annual debt service. Debt coverage margin is the reciprocal of the debt coverage ratio, that is 1 divided by DCR. Cash flow margin is the complement of the debt coverage margin, that is 1 minus DCM. Loan-to-value ratio, debt present value divided by the maximum allowable offer. Equity to value is the complement of the loan-to-value ratio, or 1 minus LTV. Leverage to debt, this is the LTV divided by the ETV. That is, for each dollar of equity, the LTD measures how many dollars of debt you are obtaining. Net cash flow is the cash flow margin times the net operating income. It's simply the amount of cash flow left over after servicing the debt. Equity is the equity to value ratio times the maximum allowable offer. Return on equity, it's the net cash flow divided by the equity. And now we can expand these equations. The return on equity equals the net cash flow over equity. We can expand both sides to show that the net cash flow equals CFM times NOI. The equity is ETV times MAO. We can then expand the equation further to show that the NOI over the MAO is the cap rate, and perform a substitution. Further substituting, we see that the return on equity equals the CFM times DCR times ADC times LTV divided by ETV. You can see here that the cap rate equation has been substituted. Next, we then substitute for LTV divided by ETV the leverage to debt. Now we substitute for the cash flow margin the quantity 1 minus DCM, and then we substitute for DCM the value 1 divided by DCR. And finally, we then carry the product of the expression times DCR is now DCR minus 1 times the ADC times the LTD for the return on equity. Thus you can see that both the cap rate and the row are both tied to the DCR, ADC, and LTV. Example 1, cap and row. We have a debt coverage ratio of 1.25, which is a very common debt coverage ratio for commercial properties. We calculate the debt coverage margin, the reciprocal, is 80%. The complement of the debt coverage margin is the cash flow margin, that's 20%. The amortization term is 300 periodic payments. Each period is 1 month. This is 25 years. The annual interest rate is 6%. We blend the term and the rate together to calculate the annual debt constant, 7.7316%. The loan-to-value ratio, 80%, another common ratio for commercial income properties. Equity to value ratio is the complement, that's 20% equity. Leverage to debt, 80% divided by 20% is 4. That is, for each dollar of equity, you have $4 of debt. And the capitalization rate calculates to 7.7316%. This is equal to the annual debt constant because the debt coverage ratio, 1.25, happens to be the reciprocal of the loan-to-value ratio. Multiplying those two numbers together equals 1, and 1 times the annual debt constant equals the annual debt constant. The return on equity, 7.7316%. That's also equal to the annual debt constant. Why is that? Well, from the equation for the return on equity, the debt coverage ratio minus 1 is 0.25. And the leverage to debt ratio is 4. 0.25 times 4 is 1, and 1 times the annual debt constant is the annual debt constant. The leverage to yield is 1.0. That is the return on equity divided by the cap rate. From these numbers, we can then show that for a net operating income of $40,000, the maximum allowable offer can be no more than $517,357. You can see here that the leverage to yield ratio of 1.0 is equal to the cash flow margin divided by the equity to value ratio. 20% divided by 20% is 1. That is, the investor in this deal is not getting any leverage on the investment. He'd be better off to take his equity investment and pay all cash for a smaller property at the same cap rate and be debt-free. Example 2, cap and row. There is only one change in this example from example 1, and that is the debt coverage ratio has been increased to 1.5. Now the debt coverage margin and the cash flow margin are calculated. Same amortization term, same annual interest rate, same annual debt constant, same loan-to-value ratio, same equity-to-value ratio, same leverage-to-debt ratio. And now we see that the cap rate is slightly higher. Now it's 9.2779%. That change came from the change in the debt coverage ratio, increasing the DCR from 1.25 to 1.5. And the return on equity is now higher. It's actually double before because if you remember from the return on equity equation, the factor DCR minus 1 has changed from 0.25 to 0.5. So it's effectively doubled the return on equity. And the leverage to yield has now increased to 1.6667. With the same net operating income of $40,000, we then calculate the maximum allowable offer is $431,131. Just by changing the debt coverage ratio from 1.25 to 1.5. The debt coverage ratio is a critical factor in calculating the cap rate and the return on equity and in controlling the volatility of your leveraged asset. By increasing the debt coverage ratio to 1.5, we've actually reduced the risk of this investment in case of recessionary pressure on expenses or income, so that we have a much larger cushion of cash flow to service the debt. Introduction to Income Valuation and Syndication. Learn how to calculate the income valuation of an income property. Learn how to calculate the yields for multiple tranches, structured financing. Learn how to get paid to buy income property with other people's money, OPM. Learn how to get paid when you buy with OPM, get paid a percentage of cash flow, and get paid a percentage of the exit strategy. The exit strategy could be refinancing the property with cash out or selling to a retail investor. Go to this website to learn more about Introduction to Income Valuation and Syndication. This has been Calculating Capitalization Rate. My name is Jeffrey Smith, and thank you for your support.